Welcome to chapter 28. We're going to start talking about a lot of what I'll just call isms, right? At the end of words, we're going to see a lot of isms, a lot of different movements, a lot of movements that are inspired by, of course, not only the society that's happening, but just artists wanting to break away from the norm. One of the biggest reasons why is photography. And so we'll talk about that and how photography helps artists branch out since they don't have to stay true to the image anymore, right? If a photo can capture things realistically so quickly, right, then why do we need to paint so realistically? And artists are sort of given a door of freedom here. So one other major thing or several major things that are going on in the society is that we have all these other influences that I list here, ideas on philosophy, ideas on how we should basically be how we were created. So it's challenging once again, sort of science and the Enlightenment, and where things come from. So we're expanding on those origins with Darwin's writings. Urbanization and industrialization, right? We have more railroads being built. We have people moving from the rural countryside into the urban uh, places where there's jobs. Just the technology is beginning to grow. So economies are growing, right? Countries are interacting differently, realizing that they trade with one another instead of warring with one another, right? Things can change, but or be more prosperous. And then, I'd give you some numbers there as far as really how quickly things are growing within a short period of time. So the first one, the biggest one, Impressionism. And I put a lot of resources on Moodle for you guys to watch. So if you want to just roll through some of those videos of your favorite isms, that'll help you sort of figure some of this stuff out. But we looked at Manet's previous works when you think of sort of Luncheon on the Grass and that sort of thing, where he's really sort of messing around with the pictorial space. Uh, so we had those first real sort of like modernist paintings coming out. Well, he also transitions and is also a part of the impressionistic movement. So he's on both sides, and he's that bridge between the two because he's taking these subjects and these areas of distortion and really sort of using that simplified brushstroke. And the impressionists, they build off of that, but he gets lumped into them. Um, and this piece is always great because it's up to a lot of speculation, is because of sort of the elusive and impermanence of the subject matter. This piece is always being discussed for its meaning, what's really going on, and we think that it shows a scene of a barmaid looking at us, but we don't really know if she's looking at us or if maybe there's actually a mirror behind her, like most bars are, and we can see her reflection behind her, which could be another gal, but it could be her just because there's a lot of similarities, and she's talking to a patron, right? We see this trapeze act in the upper left-hand corner of the piece where you see just the upper left legs there. And we see a lot of items for sale going on, and so is there symbolic? Is she for sale? Is this man trying to be a part of this persuasion of her? We don't really know, but these are a lot of the interpretations that go with this piece that make it sort of something of an enigma. But in Impressionism, this is the first impressionistic piece, really impressionistic style. It's deemed true impressionism, and by Monet. And I put in there Monet and Manet, that film on Canopy. That's really good. And this is done in a style called plein air. Uh, Plein air, right? Painting out in the landscape. And the reason why the impressionists are actually able to really move out to the landscape is because now we have the invention of tubes of paint, and also things like oil pastels, things that are portable. Before, everything had to be made by the artists in the studio, and so they were really limited. And this is sort of a great advantage, so they can go out and they can study color and they can look at what's really going on with the light. Impressionist, like other titles and labels, were meant as a critic review to be derogatory, right? That it wasn't anything but just an impression. Well, and then that's stuck, right? And to this day, we still love impressionistic style. In fact, it's the number one money maker of any art show in any museum worldwide, right? Those will always draw the most. In fact, there's even a joke that how does a museum spell money? Monet, right? Monet, right? And this is another one of his pieces that Monet did where he was really studying light, and he painted this several times, the same cathedral again and again and again, and showing it at different times of the day. So we really understand more of his process by this, and I have that link there to see the entire series of them. Another impressionist is Renoir, and the link is really great for the symbolism and such in it. But we just see a Parisian dance hall going on. Renoir uses and likes to use color that evokes sounds and noise and a sense of place. So color is now meaningful. It's more, I guess, how Delacroix would use it, because it's not about being true so much the palette as it is observe what's in nature and then use those brush strokes to sort of create the mood and the feeling of the scene. Many of the models in here that we see are actually his friends that we know, and what's kind of interesting is the viewer is sort of included on this. Like we feel like maybe we're at a table, like we're watching all this, and we're not sort of like an onlooker. We're not pushed out. So somehow he's kept us in a part of the crowd. So that's a pretty nice feature for the composition. But he uses those contrasting colors, the brights with the dulls, the darks with the lights, all of that to really help create sort of the entire mood that's going on there. I show this piece specifically for how it works with how Impressionists started to get new compositions, something that hadn't happened before. This one isn't as direct of comparison when we look at the two and say like, oh, well, they copied it verbatim, but we do see the same themes being going on. So the woman bathing and the woman bathing over here, but there are other Impressionist pieces that look like direct copies. I put the printing process in there because I feel like it's very important to understand like why in Japanese prints the space looks flattened and why things happen the way they do just because of the medium being used, right? And some of the limitations that are with that. And then, of course, cultural style. But what's happening is that the Impressionists are taking directly from the Japanese prints, and these prints are coming over actually as packaging paper for other trade goods. In the right around 1870s, Japan opens its harbors for the first time, so they're trading all over, and these prints come out and they are picked up by artists in these shops, and they're just marveling at how the space is utilized, right? It's not real perspective, but there is a sense of depth going on. So the Impressionists take that, they flatten the space, the subject matters, and they just add sort of their type of brushstroke to it. So there's a real synthesis of East meets West here. You will find others that like Mary Cassatt and such that are direct copies of a Japanese print, but it just is more European looking individuals. This is actually one of my favorite paintings. I love this Nocturne in Black and Gold by Whistler, and he's an American expat, and that's kind of important because a lot of American artists, we're just sort of getting our feet wet still with even art being legitimate eyes by Americans. So he's one, but he was I think he was born in Italy, studied in Paris, lived in London. I mean, just kind of jumped around a lot, but because of that, he knew a lot of styles. He knew the Impressionist artists and what they were doing. He's been exposed to a lot, and with this painting was heralded as just nothing but splatters, right? Something that just seems so off the wall that there's just no way that this could ever be considered art. But when you look deeper into it, it's quite amazing what's going on here. And it's also known as falling rocket, right? So you can imagine those sparks at night and the sort of the crashing and blowing out that's going on. I mentioned briefly before already about Mary Cassatt. And so here's an image of hers. Mary Cassatt is an American through and through, and probably doesn't even get as much due diligence as she should. She is one of the most famous Impressionists, but then also the most famous impressionist female artist and one of the most well-known female artists. But what her contribution is that she's actually studied art in Philadelphia, so she's well versed, and then goes to live in Paris because she knows that's where the center of the art world is at this moment, and is actually found by Degas. She's in museums sketching and such, and Degas, as the story goes, saw her and then, invited her to come to sort of be a part of this other group of the Impressionists, and said that if you looked at her work, you wouldn't realize that she was a woman because she draws so well. She must be a man. And that kind of shows you still the sexism that's going on at the time. But she is well regarded by her peers, and so she gets to work with him and starts drawing off those Japanese concepts of space in her works as it's happening from those prints. But she's one of the most famous impressionists, so it's really really incredible to see her and also know that she's the beginning of sort of a tradition for American women painters. Post-impressionism. What may be sort of odd is you may say, well, how is this even impressionist when we look at something like Toulouse-Lautrec's lithograph here? And the post-impressionists are taking some of the tenets of impressionism. They're taking the idea that we're going to study light and color, but what they want to do is make it a little bit more expressive and a little bit more meaningful. If you look at those previous ones, Degas, it's sort of still their studies, they are of nature. Well, now they want to sort of branch out and say, well, we can do so much more with color, and from the scenes of nature or the scenes where we're going that still inspire us. And so Toulouse-Lautrec, maybe you guys have heard, he was stunted in growth by disease at a young age, so smaller man. And if you ever watched the movie Moulin Rouge with Nicole Kidman and stuff, you see cameos to him. But he is going to these Moulin Rouge and these burlesque shows. And Jane Averill, this poster here, is actually one of the more famous dancers. So this is a sort of depiction of her. But that's where he's drawing his inspiration from. But post-impressionism is really defined by that expressive look at the subject matter and the more formal elements of the work. So here we can see roots in impressionism, but stylistically it's starting to change more and more. We have sometimes, what do I want to say? Like, we want to sometimes see things that are just so outrageously done that even color becomes very arbitrary. So. One of those in the post-impression that invented a term you'll need to know called pointillism is Georges Seurat. And what's really interesting is he's kind of, I'd say almost like Leonardo, who's more like a scientist than an artist, right? Who's so interested in optics and what's being published at the time of optics that he creates a system in which you use smaller dots of color near to each other and overlap to create all the variety of colors. So he's really using a very limited palette, and usually the primary colors specifically, and by placing them next to each other in more groupings of, let's say, red versus yellow, right, you're going to get a more red-orange and stuff. So he's able to control that. So if you get up close, it's just a bunch of dots, but when you get away from it, it looks like the full scene. So he's able to control these. They're gorgeous in their own right, and if you ever get to just see them in a museum and be up close, they're quite stunning, knowing the time that it would have taken to do one of these. But he's sort of the first that's really letting us understand like how we as human beings receive color and perceive color, and really sort of start to solidify more and more the color theory that's placed from Isaac Newton, because Newton's the one, of course, gives us what we know of for light and color and how they're interconnected, and how we have the color wheel and how we can see true complementaries and all that stuff. So check out the link. It's really good, sort of brief intro on him. And of course, you can't talk about post-impressionism without Vincent van Gogh, probably the most known artist next to a couple of the classical masters and Picasso, right? Van Gogh, if you asked the top favorites, he'd probably be on the top of most people's list. He uses form and color to distort and distortions of those to express feelings and emotions. He was the pastor's son. And at a young age, Actually, he had a sibling who died that was named Vincent, and they buried him under the steps of the house. And so when Vincent was born and they gave him his name, they said, well, this was the real Vincent, right? This is the first Vincent. And then every time you kind of imagine having to walk over those steps, walk into your house, and they would say that this is where the real Vincent lies, right? You realize that, wow, this is going to lead to some problems. So he suffered from a lot of mental health and depression. He was always seeking love and attention. And if you guys have ever watched that new movie that's out called Vincent, and they hand painted all the movie scenes in it, it's very interesting. It tells you sort of some of the conspiracies on his life and how he ended up. He is the one who gave a piece of his ear to a prostitute that he was in love with. She had said, "Oh, well, why don't you leave a piece of yourself with me instead?" And so he cut off his ear, gave it to her. Like, there was kind of like, here it is. And his brother Theo really supported him in life and was a art seller, so tried to sell his work. But Vincent only ever sold one work in his entire life, and most of his stuff was committed in and out of insane asylums, which is also where this is. He would check himself in to try and get over a few things, then check himself out, and he was just a very sort of troubled individual. But it's said that he's committed suicide. Some believe he was murdered, but it's kind of more on the side that he committed suicide in. But his expressiveness and stuff is just par none with anybody else. Actually, Gauguin, who Vincent van Gogh was a huge admirer of, and they had lived together to learn and paint from one another. But Gauguin he's an ex-lawyer, actually, and he wanted, so when he starts painting, he actually is kind of a pompous guy, where he really thought he could do it better than anybody else. And I'm sorry, he was not a lawyer. He was a stockbroker. Sorry, I was wrong about that. But he really got very deeply and symbolic in his work. And he was highly influenced by Van Gogh working together. But they had a temper, and they would go back and forth and fight, and stated many times how he was the best painter ever, and was really quick to ridicule others. But eventually he moves to Tahiti, where this work like this happens. And in this work, what we see is the title, Where Do We Come From, and Where Are We, right? So what we see is sort of the stages of life. We have birth over here, and we have old age and sort of death over here, and in the middle, sort of youth and vitality. So he's talking a lot about life and how we move, and then there's these other symbolic features in here that are about the piece. But the thing is that he dies. Some believe maybe he died of syphilis, but he leaves his family back in France, moves to Tahiti, and is very promiscuous there. And to this day, they're still relatives of Gauguin in the village. So, fun fact. Cezanne, another one of the big names, he painted scenes of this towards the end of his life, and he created several of them, a series of them, and this is one of the many views. He was really looking for sort of formal structure underneath all that brushwork. So underneath, you still feel like there's movement, that there's something solidified, that there's something that we could sort of like attach ourselves to, that wasn't just a bunch of expression of color. So what's kind of interesting is when you really look at this, you can still see the town, you can still see what is like forests and all that, and that's that underlying formal structure that I'm talking about with all this brushwork. Is that the brushwork is just sort of like the outer skin sort of beauty that he can possess, but underneath it we still get the entirety of the scene. So if you looked at the lines and the colors of nature, we know that like he's painting directly from the outdoors. He's looking exactly at those, and he's taking his brush and using it, I almost imagine like in a grid-like structure. So what he'll do is he uses a lot of ultramarine blue to create the undertones, and then from there build on top of that. And the brush is sort of held vertically, and then and with loaded paint, and then just pulled down, and these like vertical strokes. So we see this sort of like squares right here, right? You can see all these squared vertical strokes right? That you can imagine just pull down, pull down, pull down, pull down. And so he's repeating that process again and again and again, and then adding those reflected light colors all over. So a little bit of what's happening down here is then bouncing up and hitting up on the mountainside here. So, but to look at his earlier work to see kind of compare and contrast, right? We still see that same brushiness on the background. The foreground's a little bit more refined, and this is an earlier piece. And works like these are experiments to really remake Impressionism, right? These are some of the first sort of trying to bridge the gap between pure Impressionist to a more open style. He's juxtaposing colors, reds and greens, to help show space and depth, right? The idea that we can see that right in here in this Bass Apples, that helps separate the two. One goes further backwards and one's pushed forward because of those complementary colors. He painted from fake forms, really. So his fruit and stuff sometimes come off very just spherical than the actual contours of the shapes that are going on. So he's not really even interested so much of the purest form of truth. He's interested more in formal elements again. Explored and painted them from multiple viewpoints. So he'll draw and paint and then move his easel a little bit and draw and paint again and move his easel a little bit and draw and paint. So he's able to arrange, and that's going to be a really big stepping stone for people like the Cubists here later on when we talk about that. Symbolism is they and the artists that are a part of the symbolic movement, they created works to express their individuality, their spirit, and they wanted to reject images of daily life, right? They wanted to show like a fantasy world. Like this one in particular is inspired from a biblical scene of John the Baptist, and he's beheaded and such. And so this is the wife Salome wanting that gift of John the Baptist's head that when her husband asked for it. So there's still some those earlier themes going on, but when we look at that, I mean, we look at sort of the scene painted in the back, and everything's sort of like lavishly done and made up. These aren't from models or anything like that. One of the most well-known painters is Moreau, and he's inspired directly by Delacroix. And I think that that's pretty evident when we look at some of these Eastern patterns and things, that when we think of like the Women of Algiers or the earlier Delacroix, where the Persian king is, there's a woman being sacrificed at his feet. So you can see that directly, but he's showing sort of the exotic and mystical, and the what's called the femme fatale, or fatal woman here, right? The woman who's going to curse the guy, send some man to his death. And so that's a term that they use for sometimes images like these. Like I said, it was a biblical reference, and still using a lot of exotic though. So we can see it sort of harbinger back to some of the romantic works, but now everything is sort of standing into for some meaning. And probably one of the more inspirational symbolic or symbolist painters is Rousseau, and he's actually self-taught, and his works aren't really widely accepted. And when you look at them, they almost look stiff or paper cut out. There's some refinement in tonality in some areas, and cohesively it works very well together and stuff, but it comes off very almost tribal in ways. It's something that almost like it's a very cultural sort of look at a scene. This one we call the Sleeping Gypsies, but the figures seem stiff and unnatural. We think of that lion; he looks stiff, and even his tail looks like it can never really move. That's more sculptural. His works are really mysterious, and I mean his imagination and sort of this another exotic that we see going on here. But we really don't know what's going on. We don't really know the symbolism in his pieces, but he definitely in the way he handles space inspires later artists. Probably the most emotional work that if anything, and there's a great film on him on Canopy, there's Edvard Munch, and his works are all about love and death. And The Scream, we know this piece very well, another very popular piece, but Munch was really just tormented by always looking for love. he was surrounded by death. His family and sister and mother all died. In his family, they died at an early age, and is really known for sort of painting the psychic life sort of like inside of his head. You know, these images, what was tormenting, these kind of exercising those inner demons on paper. And this image came from really actually being intoxicated as he walked over a bridge. And later he recalls sort of the horror in his mind while he did it, you know, sort of that blurriness and that waviness, and you can almost sort of feel the queasiness of it all. And that's where it came from. And it's kind of rare because you never really hear of artists talking about what inspired them in certain moments. And this one is maybe reasons why we have a stereotypical representation that, oh, all artists must be on drugs or drunk in order to do something like that. Well, this one, yes, but most of them, no. Another symbolic painter is Gustav Klimt, fascinating works. His father was a goldsmith, and so he used actually a lot of gold leaf in his paintings, and there's a great sort of talk about him on that YouTube link there. But he's interested in patterns. Art Nouveau was also kind of going on right now at this time. So things like Tiffany glass and stuff. So we have that geometrical representations going on. We have the woman is represented here by circles and the man by squares. And in later pieces, sometimes we see these sort of like intermingle, sort of like referencing sort of the love between them. He was actually, though, on Hitler's degenerate art list, and so some of his works have been destroyed because of that. And granted, that's fast forwarding a lot, but you know, there's a lot of artwork that we still don't have today because it was deemed not appropriate for that individual, so they were destroyed. If you want a really good reference on him, there's a movie out called Woman in Gold, and it talks about a contemporary issue about Gustav Klimt's work and the family who owned it that was stolen by the Nazis. And Ryan Reynolds plays the lawyer in it, and helps get back. It's a really good film, so check that out. Probably one of the most well-known sculptors of all time, but definitely for this period, is Auguste Rodin, and he did The Thinker. If anybody can sort of recall that iconic piece of the man sort of hunched over thinking about, and he's really the only sculptor doing stuff during the time of the Impressionists, right? That movement has taken hold, and so a lot of just classical antiquity work isn't really sought after, but Rodin is able to sort of keep it alive but add this more emphatic feeling to it. He did these expressive figures in a time when emotions ruled, and this representation of the burghers of Calais is actually a true story about the burghers, or the town leaders, that, as the story goes, they're actually surrounded at a time by another army, and the army threatens to destroy the entire town unless they give up these leaders. And of course, the town, who actually found them very fun, was like, no, we're not going to give up these people. But the burghers at night got together and decided that they were not going to let all these other people suffer for them. So they all walked out there by themselves, and then when the people woke up the next morning, they found them all hanging. So yeah, but the town was spared. So that's how it goes. A piece that, if you went all the way back to the early Renaissance, and we talked about doors and a door competition and Brunelleschi, and that was called the Gates of Heaven, or Gates of Paradise. Well, now we have the Gates of Hell. We have the opposite of that, and here's Rodin's The Gates of Hell, and it's large. And watch the link about this particular piece. It will give you a lot of insight. But the doors were actually meant for a museum, but they were never built. And so what we have here is just sort of that mock-up that were put there, and it truly meant to contrast Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise that we saw earlier. And what we're seeing here is depictions of Dante's Inferno. So instead of using the biblical reference, we're using sort of a secular image of the same religion. And you can see on sort of the sides, like all sort of the images of people cast down and suffering and the layers of hell, if you know anything about Dante's Inferno. And up here we see that iconic thinker again. So that's kind of a cool thing. I mentioned Art Nouveau a little bit with Gustav Klimt. And so there's some interesting things that happen because it's a movement that really is about sort of art, crafts and architecture and stuff. It's not going to be specific to just like painting and sculpture or what's considered fine art. They're really going to just make it about the everyday. So when we think of Tiffany lamps and stuff, we're talking about everyday consumption, a part of their life. Art Nouveau just really means new art. It's just really about how we can see art more of like in our everyday life. And Gaudi is, and if you go throughout Barcelona, you'll see a lot of his work specifically there. And it has this sort of like whimsical, in fact, it makes me think of like ice cream dessert toppings with sprinkles and stuff like that, how it is. But really, really cool stuff. And I have a film on Moodle, or a link on Moodle about him that just talks about his other pieces there. Just really amazing work. And then last in this chapter we're going to talk about is the Eiffel Tower by Alexander Eiffel. It's built for the World's Fair in Paris of 1889. And the reason why it was built is because there's a new technology in cast iron. So it was sort of a monument to say, this is what we can do with this material. It really wasn't meant to be up the whole time. Of course, it's structurally sound to be there, but it wasn't supposed to be up as long as it is, and never intended to be sort of an icon for Paris the way it is. But he was able to make a structure longer, span larger spaces, all with this material. So it showed its flexibility to not only do curves, but sort of the straight lines. Of course, there's elevators that are inside there. And so now, we imagine the Eiffel Tower is this iconic thing, but really it's just sort of this test, you could say, to see what we could do with it. Eiffel is known, and maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but designed many public buildings and the structure for the inside of the Statue of Liberty. So technically, we could say there's an Eiffel Tower inside the Statue of Liberty. And this material, and this piece proved it, but with this material gives rise to the modern skyscraper. So we see really in the United States, this picked up and they start building, especially when we think of the New York skyline and Chicago, and cast iron buildings now they become in. So we will continue in chapter 29.